Hello and welcome to My Own Devices. We are very pleased that you decided to watch this video. Remember, subscribing to this channel is totally and completely free, and we promise to never charge you any fees to watch. Thank you.
Hello! A few months ago, my son told me that his roommate had a turntable and that he found a copy of the stage recording of Jesus Christ Superstar at a thrift store, and his Denon AV receiver didn't have a phono stage, and he wasn't sure how to hook it up. So I set about explaining what he needs to do and why record players require a special phono input. I mean, I soon realized it's not that easy to clearly explain why the whole phono input thing to a novice just getting started in vinyl records. Have you ever tried it? I think I saw his eyes glaze over after just a few minutes, and who really knows if he really understood or even cared what I was talking about. So I was thinking, maybe if I could explain the gist of it in less than a couple of minutes, I could maybe keep a person's interest or attention. So I'm going to give it a shot right here without any editing. So here goes. When a record disc is cut at the mastering lab, they equalize the signal going from the master recording to the cutting stylus. And by equalize, I mean they greatly reduce the low bass frequencies and boost up the high treble ones. Why? Because if they sent the signal straight from the recording to the disc unequalized, the low bass frequencies would make a groove that is much too wide. And the main reason that's a problem is that a wider groove would also result in a much shorter album, because less music would fit on each side of the disc. Why boost the high frequencies? Actually, boosting them up and then cutting them back with equalization makes a quieter recording, kind of like Dolby noise reduction on tapes. When you play a record, the electrical signal comes from the minute movements of the stylus vibrating inside the record groove. It creates a very weak electrical signal that travels through the thin wires and the tone arm and the cables to your amplifier. Because the signal is so weak, it needs quite a bit of extra amplification, more than other components. On top of the extra amplification, it also requires opposite equalization that reverts the sound back to the way it was on the original recording. You probably figured something was up if you ever tried to listen to a turntable that was plugged into a regular line level input, and you certainly noticed that it sounded very low in volume and tinny. For years into this journey, I barely even gave phono preamps a second thought. I would just plug the turntable into the phono inputs, the ground wire, and I was ready to go. Let's look inside a few of my own devices that have phono preamps. It's fairly easy to find the phono preamp in a receiver, for example. They can be just behind the RCA jacks on the back, or just follow the wires that will lead you to the little circuit board. Because the space inside of a receiver's case can be limited and crowded with parts in close proximity to each other, it's possible that they may pick up stray radio frequency interference and crosstalk. One thing to remember about the phono stage inside a receiver is that it's very sensitive, because its job is to take a very weak signal and amplify it a lot. So then you could say that it's reasonable to believe that any stray electrical interference coming from any nearby components will get amplified as well. Many audio enthusiasts believe that the phono stages, and radio tuners for that matter, inside vintage components like these are among the best that were ever made. Because playing vinyl records was a primary music medium, manufacturers put a lot of resources and effort into making them sound as good as possible. As I mentioned earlier, they use sound equalization when making the original record disc, and they use the same equalization in reverse when playing the record back. This equalization is called the RIAA curve. An ideal frequency graph for audio is a flat, straight line from left to right. But as you can see, records are made using equalization that greatly reduces the lower bass frequencies on the left and boosts the high ones on the right. The phono circuitry in a receiver takes this signal and performs the opposite equalization, boosting the low ones and reducing the high ones. This is designed to send an ideal flat audio signal to the amplifier. All this is clever stuff that was mostly figured out back in 1954, and As good as the Phono stages are in these vintage receivers, can you upgrade them? Well, I don't really believe it's practical to remove the old Phono stage and install a newly designed one. You know, I made a video a few weeks ago about upgrading an old CD player by adding a modern external DAC into the signal path. In the analog turntable world, you can do a similar thing by getting a separate external Phono Preamp. And like DACs, you can go from something that's pretty basic to sky's the limit. My plan is to take a few of my vintage receivers and try them with a popular external Phono Preamp and see what kind of results I get. The system I will use to evaluate will consist of a Technics SL1200Mk2 turntable with a moving magnet Shure cartridge, and these terrific Ohm Walsh 2 loudspeakers. I'm going to start this little evaluation by starting out by listening to some music using the receiver's own built-in Phono Preamp, and then I'm going to switch over and listen to the same tracks, but I'm going to run it through this wallet-friendly but very well-regarded Schiit Mani Phono Preamp. The Schiit Mani is really not much to look at, but it has pretty much everything you need to get started playing records. On the back, going from left to right, there's the line level outputs, the ground wire connection, and the phono inputs from your turntable. There's an on-off switch next, and the socket for power from the wall wart plug. Pretty standard stuff, I suppose. But when you look at the bottom, this is where we discover the Mani can handle moving magnet and moving coil cartridges. It has switches that allow you to set the cartridge's load and gain for best performance. So, using the Pioneer's built-in phono stage, the first thing I noticed was the sound was very full and bloated in the mid-bass department. The mid-range was strong, but a bit congested. And the treble was rolled off and it lacked air and detail. It felt like a big fat wave of sound was hitting me. It really sounds like an old vintage receiver. Not to say that's a bad thing. I do like the vintage sound. Connecting the Mani made a huge difference. The fat and bloated mid-bass tightened right up and sounded very nice indeed. There was also some airiness, clarity, and depth to the high frequencies that were missing before. To sum up, this Pioneer receiver sounds very nice, but it seems the Phono stage has let it down. The Mani made a huge improvement, and I would highly recommend adding it if you have one of these receivers. I've owned this Marantz for a while, and I'm familiar with its rather natural and clean sound quality. The bass is tight and controlled, but not particularly deep or warm, and the treble is crisp and articulate. The mid-range was good, but I noticed a touch of graininess, and the overall sound had a neutral tone to my ears, leaning a bit to the cool side. When I inserted the Mani into the mix, the lower bass frequencies made an appearance. It was deeper, but just as tight as before. An improvement in my opinion. The Mani smoothed out the slight graininess in the mids, but also reduced the high frequencies a bit. It warmed up the sound, which surprised me. Although not as pronounced of an improvement as with the Pioneer, I would definitely consider the Mani as a noticeable upgrade. I must admit, this Sansui is currently my favorite receiver. It sounds just so good to me. The first thing I noticed in this evaluation was that it has quite meaty bass. That was tight and it went pretty deep. The vocals and mid-range frequencies are lush and superb. Now the treble is not as pronounced and detailed as Marantz, but it's smoother and more natural sounding. And you know, the Mani did make an impact. The deeper bass notes were reduced a bit actually, and tightened up just a smidgen. And the wonderful mid-range notes remained as fine as ever. However, the high frequencies were emphasized quite nicely. The Mani added an overall brighter tone to the sound by reducing the bass and giving it a treble boost. Now, I consider the results with the Sansui to be kind of a toss-up. The Mani added a noticeable increase in the high frequencies, but I did notice some reduction in the lower bass. and I could live with either and be happy. Nakamichi receivers do have a reputation for having pretty decent phono stages, so my expectations are elevated. This model is about 15 years newer than the other receivers, so that may make a difference. The integrated phono stage in this is very good. Its excellent dynamics and punchiness are clearly audible. The bass is firmly under control and satisfyingly deep. The mid-range is very smooth and open. However, there is a touch of upper mid-range glare at higher volumes. I find the high trebly tone to be pleasing and articulate, and there is audible space between the instruments. With the Mani preamp connected, the treble is boosted a bit in contrast to the built-in one, especially when I turn up the volume. And I could detect upper mid-range glare on piano and saxophone, for example. Bass is about the same as before, but the Mani once again brightened up the sound of the receiver. To me, this is a clear case of sticking with what the Nakamichi has. The Mani did not bring anything to the party, and I would not consider it to be an upgrade. I like to say that compared to the digital domain with DACs, etc., the difference between analog components can be much more profound. The differences often are far, far less subtle and easier to hear and describe to others. And for only $129, the Schiit Mani is a great value and a really simple way to upgrade the sound of a vintage receiver or integrated amp. It's way cheaper than recapping, and if you don't like it, it can be easily returned. And you can't say that about a recap job. Now, I believe I've reached the point where I want to go up to another level. What if I upgraded from the Schiit Mani to something a bit more upmarket and accomplished? A device that is from a legendary company that has been making fine hi-fi components for decades. Well, that sounds like a fantastic idea. Okay then, here it is. This is the Parasound Zphono XRM Phono Preamp. Look out for an upcoming video in which I put this baby through a thorough exploration and evaluation. I'd also like to take this opportunity to tell you that it's my pleasure to provide videos on topics like this that you're interested in. And, you know, if you like this kind of video, please consider subscribing and liking and sharing with friends. I think I'm trying to grow this channel and would appreciate any type of support that I can get. Thank you very much.